Muslims in Catalonia. So please welcome Tilman Lanz.
Thank you, Rick. And thank you all for having me, us here. Eva more in effigy than in reality, but I hope I do her work as much justice. In this paper, we investigate the interplay between religion and language in the context of immigration to Catalonia. We present results from our research in Barcelona and some surrounding communities about language attitudes and practices among Muslim immigrants on the one hand, and on the other hand, their religious practices, affiliations, and activities. In bringing these two fundamental human categories into conjunction, we aim to contribute to the lively, ongoing, and highly relevant debate about the role of religion and language of immigrants in the region, especially given the well-known fact that linguistic policies are of the utmost importance in Catalonia as it strives for more independence from the Spanish nation-state. We present results from qualitative research that we have undertaken in the summers of 2004 and 2007, as well as in the winter of 2009-10. During these research stays, we have conducted ethnographic research among a number of organizations in the larger Barcelona area that offer services to immigrants, as well as religious and non-religious organizations by immigrants, all of which offering some form of language instruction or guidelines to their users. We offer insight into how a variety of organizations relate language choices of Catalan and Spanish to the practice, facilitation, and function of Islam. On the basis of our findings, we hope to contribute to two general questions. First, what is the role of the rapidly growing immigrant communities in the context of ongoing Catalan efforts for language revitalization and maintenance? And second, how does the highly charged issue of reconciling a modern Western way of life with an Islamic way of life bear on language choices among Muslim immigrants in the immigrant context of Catalonia? Our research aims to conjoin these two important questions, and it aims to show how their interrelation bears on the shaping of language policies by the Catalan government, how it influences immigrant communities and the organizations that represent them, and finally, how immigrants themselves navigate their religious practices in conjunction with their attitudes towards various languages. We begin with an overview of the recent phenomenon of immigration in Catalonia. Against the backdrop of this overview, we will then present 4 case studies of immigrant organizations to illustrate a number of different ways in which immigrants tie together language use and religious practices. Finally, we will present a number of conclusions as well as projections for possible future developments in the relation between Islam and language practices and attitudes in Catalonia. It is, first of all, important to remind ourselves that immigration in larger numbers to Catalonia is a very recent phenomenon. It's also a phenomenon that's happened very rapidly over the past 15 years. During this time, immigrants have come from all 4 corners of the world in the context of a globalizing economy. And I cannot highlight the stunning numbers enough. You know, here we have, in 1996, we have 1.61% foreign population, and only a mere 13 years later, we have 15, almost 16%. This is, you know, if you compare it to other countries in Europe, this is unsurpassed, absolutely unsurpassed. Just to give you some figures, in Germany, even today, we do not have 15% foreign population. We have about, you know, between 10 and 12%. And certainly in countries like Germany, this has risen much more gradually, much slower, over much longer periods of time. This is very rapid, this is very fast, and as we'll see, it is also significantly different as in other European countries. This sets the case of immigration in Catalonia markedly apart from other older patterns of migration to European countries, such as Germany and France. In the latter cases, migration happened under very different conditions. First, it happened about 30 to 40 years earlier. Second, as a consequence, these earlier migration movements were much more controlled by governments, usually through bilateral agreements. And third, migrant populations were, as a result, far more homogeneous. For instance, the Turks in Germany and Maghrebines in France. One major difference is the lack of homogeneity of the immigrant populations in Catalonia. As the graph shows, there are indeed larger or smaller groups of immigrants in Catalonia today. Moroccan immigrants from Spanish-speaking countries and Pakistanis are the largest groups. But compared to all the patterns of migration to European countries, the heterogeneity and diversity of the immigrant groups is significant. Moreover, immigrant groups within other European countries were also more internally homogeneous, instead of the fluid diasporas influenced by strong networks spanning various conventional nation states, typical of the globalization realities of today. These differences in migratory patterns have had radically different consequences for the local situation of the migrants as they began to live in these countries. As a result, the Catalan and Spanish governments are faced with significantly different challenges in how to approach these diverse migrant groups. Because of their diversity, the migrants in Catalonia today have vastly different needs and demands in their new home country, forcing the government at the local, regional, and national level to adapt a different approach in treating each of these groups. This requirement to account for the diversity among the immigrant population is not least felt in the domain of linguistic policies. As is well known, the region of Catalonia achieved, or rather recovered, a significant amount of autonomy in the wake of the Franco dictatorship and the construction of a federalized, democratic Spanish state in the late 70s and early 80s. In this context, lingering but widespread feelings for more independence remain among the Catalan population, as well as the political leadership emerging in Catalonia, especially in the context of its adjoining the EU. These feelings, often ambiguous and complex, crystallized around the issue of linguistic identity. The Catalan language became an icon and a point of crystallization of these ambiguous and complex feelings in lieu of other possibilities such as a clearly defined national territory, a homogeneous population, or historic events that have served as such icons in many cases. As a consequence, the antagonism between the heterogeneous Catalan movements for independence and equally heterogeneous attempts by the Spanish state to retain Catalonia within its national domain has often shown itself on the field of linguistic policy. In this context, the Catalan language has become a battleground for symbolic struggles over the future of Catalonia as an integral part of Spain or the possible secession of the region. Even though debates over these issues have, during the past 3 decades, been oftentimes heated and highly controversial, the underlying antagonism quickly manifested itself in a profoundly binary structure. On the one hand was the Spanish state defending its national prerogative and protecting its interests. On the other hand were a diverse set of Catalan interest groups pushing for ever more regional autonomy, oftentimes, but not always, with the hope to further prospects for an eventual Catalan independence. It is in this situation that immigration to Catalonia has occurred over the past 15 years. The significance of this immigration for the binary antagonism between the Spanish and the Catalan sides in the conflict over more autonomy for the region cannot be overestimated, especially in its long-term implications. Immigration to Catalonia has effectively broken up the long-standing binary antagonism between the Spanish state and Catalan desires for independence. This discursive triangulation is now beginning to have a profound impact on the linguistic field. While the traditional dichotomy is inevitably still present, the immigration phenomenon has introduced a third element. Depending on the majority language choices by immigrants, they will either provide life-saving support to the Catalan language revitalization efforts, or be the last nail in the coffin for Catalan to join the many minoritized languages in the common grave of our present linguistic world. Ongoing attempts for a continued revitalization of Catalan in the public sphere and in education now have to take into account the presence of a significant population that in many cases speaks neither Spanish nor Catalan. Concretely, the question emerges whether immigrants in Catalonia should learn Spanish or Catalan first. From the perspective of Catalan language planners, the Generalitat, the Catalan regional government, and those supporting more Catalan independence, this is a particularly difficult situation. It is difficult because the last decade marks a period in which Catalan linguistic revitalization policies and maintenance strategies have shown results. Now, however, these policies and strategies need to be crucially readjusted to accommodate the rapidly changing demographic situation in Catalonia. To it, they have to take into account the immigrant dimension. To illustrate this, we will now present 4 case studies from our research in Barcelona and the surrounding communities. The 4 cases we present can be taken as representative of different strategies adopted in this context. These examples will also illustrate the vast array of responses to the linguistic situation of the immigrants, as well as the language policies implemented by the Generalitat. I'm actually going to, this is a longer paper, so I'm actually going to skip the first example, which gives you the case of an organization run by Catalan and Spanish speakers, the Asociación Educativa Integral de Naval, that just sort of serves us as a model to show how Catalans and Spanish speakers are approaching the issue. There are 2 things that are of importance in discussing this case. The first is that almost without exception, Spanish is preferred over Catalan by the immigrants, even if it is offered in an even keel. And the second one is that these Catalan organizations have significant difficulties to access the diversity that I spoke of earlier among the immigrant populations, that they cannot provide the kind of services that organizations by immigrants themselves are able to provide. So these are the 2 points that we're making here. Let me move on to the first immigrant organization. The Asociación Cultural, Educativa y Social Operativa de Dones Pakistanesas, or ASESO. In English, this is Cultural, Educational, and Social Organization for Pakistani Women, is an organization run by immigrants. It is run in principle by Huma Jamshed, a charismatic, highly educated, and entrepreneurial woman who is herself a Pakistani immigrant. Jamshed came to Spain in 1994 when she followed her husband to Madrid, where he was working for Pakistan International Airlines. Jamshed had continued her studies begun in Pakistan to obtain a PhD in chemistry during her stay in Madrid. In 2001, both Jamshed and her husband moved to Barcelona, where they set up a travel agency. This agency mainly caters to the Pakistani immigrant population, providing travel services from Barcelona to their former homeland. Jamshed herself had hoped to secure a university position in her field in Barcelona, but was unsuccessful. Over the years, Jamshed became heavily involved in the Pakistani community and started to counsel Pakistani immigrant women how to master their often difficult lives as immigrants in Barcelona. These women face a quite typical problem of immigrant women in many places in the world today. Frequently, they follow their husbands after several years into migration because the husband's temporary migrant status has become more permanent over time. The couples are finding it increasingly difficult to stay separated for most of the year, and so the women follow. Under these circumstances, however, the women come to Barcelona as mere add-ons to their husband's already established existence. As a result, they are frequently completely disconnected from public life in Barcelona, spending their days at home with only occasional visits to the local mosque or cultural center. This has made it impossible for the women to begin leading independent lives, something that was quite customary according to Jamshed in the Pakistani homeland. Quote, in Pakistan, women are mere extensions of their husband and his family. However, in Barcelona, the women lack the social network to which they have access in Pakistan. This has made many of them very unhappy, has generated feelings of isolation. Jamshed has founded her association to precisely remedy this situation. Her organization is funded both privately and through grants from the Generalitat. Its mission is to provide Pakistani women with a perspective by offering them vocational classes but also language instruction, and giving them assistance in the affairs of everyday life, by providing a social space for them to interact, and by helping them to become more autonomous from their husbands. In our conversation with Jamshed, it became clear that she designed her organization to help the women follow her own biographic model. Jamshed repeatedly emphasized that she believed in strong, autonomous women who could ideally earn their own living and get by in daily life without constant assistance or control from their husbands. Not surprisingly, Jamshed was not very popular in the male-dominated Pakistani community. As she related, Many Pakistani immigrant men would tell their wives, quote, "If you go to Ummah, I'll break your leg," end of quote. On another occasion, she stated even more bluntly, quote, "The mosque people don't like us," end of quote. But despite this, her work has been widely respected as valuable among the women and even by some of their husbands. This was certainly aided by Jamshed's own social standing and non-confrontational attitude, as well as the prominent position that her husband has in the Pakistani immigrant community in Barcelona. In our conversations, Jamshed emphasized how important it was for the women to also learn about Catalan culture, which included mastering the language. She saw this as important because, as she stated, quote, "The women live here, so they should also have the ability to move freely through this world in which they live," end of quote. As a consequence, SSL offered language instruction courses, but here too, Spanish instruction was more widely offered, allegedly because of higher demand for it than for Catalan, thereby reproducing the ideology of interpositionality of Spanish as discussed above. In addition, Jamshed's own example somewhat contradicts her statements about the importance of Catalan. In our very first meeting, Jamshed stated that her Catalan was not good enough and offered to speak in Spanish instead. However, since Lanz's command of that language was not sufficient for this purpose, the interviews were conducted in English. What is more, Jamshed also related the educational strategies that she pursued for her own two adolescent children. They were not going to school in Barcelona, but were in a prestigious boarding school close to London. This indicates two things. First, Jamshed's own socioeconomic status was very clearly different from the, from the women seeking help through her association. And second, this had important consequences for the choices in language that Jamshed believed she could make for herself, in contrast to the other immigrant women. Jamshed obviously thought that it was sufficient for her to maintain English and Spanish while she counseled the women in her organization to more firmly ground themselves within the specific locality they inhabited by learning about Catalan culture, as well as learning the language. It is most interesting in this context that Jamshed herself is the co-author of a book for immigrants and Catalan natives alike, praising the value of integration and the need for openness on both sides to communicate with each other and learn about each other. The book is interestingly written in Catalan. The Asociación de Trabajadores Pakistanesos de Catalunya, ATP, or Association of Pakistani Workers in Catalonia, is in many respects the counterpart to SSL. Its founder and main administrator is Javed Ilyas Qureshi, and the association aims to support and help Pakistani workers find employment in Catalonia, especially in Barcelona, but also in the surrounding smaller cities and towns. In addition, ATP helps these workers in daily affairs, in dealing with bureaucratic issues, and it also provides language instruction. The organization is open to all Pakistani immigrants and does not restrict its services in terms of gender, although most members are men. Ilyas has set up a number of language courses for the members of the association and other interested immigrants to learn Catalan. There is no instruction in Spanish because it is Ilyas' conviction that, quote, "We are in Catalonia and therefore we should all speak Catalan," end of quote. He hit home this point in our very first interview when he refused to speak English or Spanish and insisted that we speak Catalan. Against this backdrop, Ilyas has, over the past years, designed his own educational materials. He has, for instance, edited and published the first bilingual Punjabi Catalan textbooks for his own Catalan classes. Though ATP receives a modest amount of money from Generalitat, the support is far less extensive than for SSL. As a consequence, the services offered by ATP, including the language classes, rely far more than in other cases on personal initiative and unpaid volunteer work. This work is performed largely by the immigrants themselves, with Ilyas being personally involved in most activities. Following Ilyas' personal conviction, ATP is decidedly secular in nature and caters to the Pakistani immigrant population, which has little contact with the Islamic communities that otherwise provide support for this immigrant group. There's a distinctly different feel to the general appearance of ATP in comparison to SSL. ATP has a decidedly more proletarian image, while the perception one receives from SSL is that of an organization that caters to a population with more socially upward mobile aspirations. This can be readily observed by merely looking at the respective locations these two organizations have in Rabat. SSUB is located in a busy main street with many shops and public services, whereas LTP is found only a few blocks from there, but in a dark side alley very close to the prostitution area. Though it was not explicitly stated to us, the state of affairs is surely a direct outcome of the different socioeconomic status of both Ilyas and Jamshed. As a consequence of this status, Ilyas focused far more on the settling of the workers and their families supported through his association. In contrast, Jamshed focused on the women of already well-established Pakistani immigrant families, but emphasized the need for local attachment, for learning Catalan, and understanding Catalan culture to a far lesser degree. What both organizations share in common, however, is their commitment to provide a forum for Pakistani immigrants. In sum, we suggest that both these organizations should be seen as a pertinent example for the difficulty of providing adequate services to a recent immigrant population. On the one hand, the immigrants aim to retain as much of their cultural heritage in their new homeland. On the other hand, there's a dire need for services by these organizations that quickly and efficiently familiarize immigrants with the lived realities of this new homeland. The cultural capital necessary to provide these often contradictory services can only be reasonably provided by organizations that are run by immigrants themselves. Organizations run by Catalans can provide useful services that will make the immigrants feel more at home in Catalonia, but they will quickly fail to provide the same sense of community that can be found in organizations run by immigrants themselves. And this gets me to my last example.
We may not have time to have questions if you want to wrap up. Well, you're already, we are already in the question session. You can finish and we can not have questions and we can have them at the end.
All right, there you have it.
Yeah.
The Conseil Islamique Cultural de Catalunya, CICC, or Islamic and Cultural Council of Catalonia, is by far the largest Muslim organization in the region. It is therefore also the most important point of reference for anything concerning the rapidly growing Muslim immigrant population in Catalonia. Be it the Generalitat or any other official body of the government, the media, or anyone concerned with the Muslim population in Catalonia, the Conseil is certainly the main point of reference. While the representation of Muslims' interest in the wider public arena of Catalonia, as well as Spain, is one of its central concerns, its other main focus is to provide religious and cultural community to Muslims living in Catalonia. It runs a large number of mosques and masjids, Islamic centers, throughout Catalonia, and it organizes a wide array of religious and cultural activities, and it figures as the actual semi-official voice of Islam in Catalonia. The Conseil's self-assigned role to represent Islam in Catalonia is, however, highly problematic for several reasons. First, the organization's leadership is heavily dominated by Moroccan immigrants. In addition, the Moroccan government has a clear say in the selection of leadership, as well as in the general policies pursued by the Conseil. Even though there is also a sizable Pakistani Muslim group in its membership, this group's influence is restricted to providing imams for very few mosques that are under the general control of the Conseil. As a consequence, today the Moroccan government provides most of the imams and personnel to run the CICC directly from Morocco. These leaders are trained in Morocco and are sent for a number of years, usually no more than 6, to provide services to the Muslim population. The Generalitat and the Conseil have repeatedly exchanged niceties. The former establishing the possibility of Arabic language instruction in those public schools that request it. In this, the Conseil is, however, probably well aware of the effect that close-knit social networks, such as the ones organized around religious groups, have over linguistic practices and ideologies. Nevertheless, the Conseil has on several occasions publicly declared its commitment to promote the Catalan language among its members, including newly arrived imams. Regardless of the feasibility of both of these projects, in its representation to the public, the Conseil pursues a policy of embracing Catalan as the local culture. Its website, for instance, is exclusively in Catalan, and its various presidents have repeatedly affirmed their support for the Catalan language and culture. However, in its internal affairs, the Conseil's activities are mainly directed towards religious instruction, the maintenance of specific Islamic or at times Pakistani and Moroccan cultural value systems. Against the backdrop of this, it appears that the Conseil's frequent calls for a better integration of its members into Catalan and Western society are mostly lip service to be able to continue its unbridled pursuit of cultural and religious practices that have very little to do with anything resembling integration. And I would give now, and I'm cutting this, I would give now some examples. Let me just get to the concluding points here. These are some of the joint campaigns that I think Joan Martí might be well familiar with to approach immigrants. And let me just sort of summarize the findings. It would be helpful to schematically represent the migration process as it unfolds in time. We should understand this process first and foremost as a process of deterritorialization or delocalization by the immigrants as they enter the migratory global stream. This first step of the process usually involves migration from a rural region to a more cosmopolitan area within a particular nation state. To stick to the case at hand, we might think of the example of a young Berber from a peasant family in the mountains of Morocco migrating to one of the largest cities on the coast. And that would be sort of this arrow here, right? Where you sort of go up to the cosmopolitan global. Our Berber migrant might stay for a few weeks, months, or even years in the coastal city of Morocco and then find an opportunity to move on following globalized routes of migration to arrive in Barcelona. That second step would be happening in the global level, at the cosmopolitan level, up here, symbolized by this. While the migratory process up to this point is certainly full of insecurities and dangers, let us just assume that it went relatively smoothly. Let's just assume. Especially since we're now interested in the last step of the process, the eventual relocalization of the migrant in the homeland. This is right here. It is here in this last step of the way where significant work by the migrant in his or her new homeland will have to be performed. Relocalization is a process that has often and awkwardly been called integration. This integration or relocalization process is specifically complex, but also especially interesting in the case of Catalonia because of the Catalan-Spanish antagonism. Its particular complexity is derived from the fact that this antagonism is not merely a local one, but encompasses global and transnational aspects. The complexity of the linguistic situation which migrants encounter in Catalonia is certainly not unique. Migrants across the globe encounter similar situations or problems. However, the ongoing charged discourse about language in Catalonia is certainly unique. Furthermore, Spanish is today rapidly becoming one of the world's global languages with millions of speakers. This makes Spanish infinitely more attractive to migrants who are usually never sure whether their present place of residence will be their final destination. We saw this in the case of Uma Jamshed, who, though acknowledging the local importance of Catalan, sent her children to a British school to ensure their future ability to stay at the global level. She effectively denies them the possibility to also become grounded within local Catalan language and culture. This also appears to be a phenomenon related to class affiliation, as we saw in the example of Javed Ilyas. He was of a decidedly working class background and affirmed to a much greater degree the importance of his belonging to a specific place, of belonging to Catalonia, and of being part of Catalan society. In the examples of Ilyas and Jamshed, we have two possible ways to deal with the issues of relocalization. Ilyas solves the problem by firmly attaching themselves to the locality of Catalonia, while Jamshed remains at the global level, preferring English and Spanish to Catalan. The third possibility is pursued by the members of the Conseil. They remain like Jamshed at the global level, but in a very different way. While Jamshed's attachment to the global level is embedded within the principles of a Western secular lifestyle, the members of the Conseil choose an alternative global way of identification, that of Islam. For the Conseil members, Islam provides two things of importance. First, as a universal world religion, it allows them to partake in global processes and to feel as part of a community that is equally globalized and powerful as that of the secular West. And second, it is a venue for these immigrants to retain close ties to their former homeland and its specific religious, cultural aspects. What is denied by both Jamshed and the members of the Conseil, however, is the process of relocalization, that last arrow here that's marked in red. This is performed by Ilyas. The problem of deterritorialization for the members of the Conseil consists in gradually losing the culturally contingent attachments to their former homelands, especially as a second generation of immigrants comes of age that only knows of these former homelands from narratives or brief lessons. The same problem exists for migrants who follow the example of Jamshed. Who knows whether her children will ultimately be grateful that they were sent to a British boarding school instead of growing up in a culturally intimate context that would readily be available to Jamshed herself. While we have presented these cases of immigrants and their organizations as examples, we should remind ourselves again that the individual complexities of each of these cases are far more important than to be able to be fit into such templates. Yet, these templates seem to suggest that if the future of Catalan is to be assured, language policies will have to address the phenomenon of migration far more extensively than is done at present. The phenomenon of migration will need to be addressed in all its complexity. This means, we suggest, that immigrant organizations themselves will have to be entrusted to a far greater degree with the administration of language instruction to their members. Only these organizations are sufficiently familiar with the cultural specificities of each group and are therefore able to combine lingering feelings of attachment to the former homeland on the one hand with a gradual integration into the new homeland of Catalonia. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, not worried. We don't have time for the questions now, but hopefully we'll have time for them later, or
If you have them, just ask me privately.
yeah. So now we have Lanz coming from the Universitat de Vic from Catalonia, and yes, if you want.
Should I use that on the camera? It's on the phone.
All right. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for being here, and it's nice that Tilman provided an introduction, because this means that maybe I'll have more time because I can skip all the things that I have to say about some of the demographics in Catalonia. As you can see from the title, this is a descriptive study that looks at patterns of language use in Catalan, Spanish, and Tamasic by students in Osona, and Osona is an area of Catalonia that I'll describe a bit later. As Tilman has mentioned, there's been very important demographic changes in Catalonia and Spain in the last 10 years. The way I describe this often is by using this graph from the pact for the National Pact for Immigration that the Catalan government recently signed, that shows that from 2000 to 2008, there were 1 million of people came to Catalonia from different countries. So as Tilman